Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight for our RiverWatch winter or our fall speaker series. We're not quite to winter yet. For those of you who are not familiar with Illinois RiverWatch, we are a community science organization that trains volunteers to monitor water quality in their own communities. Illinois RiverWatch's mission is to safeguard the future of Illinois rivers and streams through stewardship, education, and sound science. Before I get started, I wanted to ask that you all keep your microphones muted during the presentation to limit any distractions. There will be a question and answer session after the presentation. So if you have questions along the way, you can put it in the chat box to be answered at the end, or you can hold on to that question yourself and ask out loud again at that Q&A session. And now I'm pleased to welcome Dusty Swedberg. Dusty graduated from Mizzou with a bachelor's in fisheries and wildlife management, and from Oklahoma State with a master's in natural resources, ecology, and management. He first began studying crayfish in 2011 when working for the Missouri Department of Conservation, and is currently an aquatic ecologist and the interim curator of crustaceans for Illinois Natural History Survey. And so now I'm pleased to introduce Dusty Swedberg.
Thank you. Everybody hear me all right? Good.
Yep.
Okay, I will share my screen here.
Looks
Okay,
good.
awesome. All right, yeah, so thank you for that. Yeah, as you said, my name's Dusty. I'm a aquatic ecologist with the Illinois Natural History Survey at the Prairie Research Institute on the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign campus. I've been with Illinois Natural History Survey now for almost 5 years, primarily studying crayfish. I originally started doing a resurvey of Illinois' crayfishes and have kind of transitioned to a more permanent role since then. But I'm going to talk about today is kind of crayfish in Illinois, and then crayfish in the Midwest in general, kind of what they're about, where they are, who they are, and hopefully um, I'll pique your interest today in them as well because I really think they're a really fascinating organism. So the age-old question anytime you talk to people about crayfish is, what is a crayfish? And this old Calvin and Hobbes sketch is sums up the look you get a lot when you tell people that this is what you study and this is what you research. Um, a lot of people don't know what a crayfish is, and a funny story. When I first started in this field, I remember telling my grandma that I was studying to start studying crayfish, and she had no idea what I was talking about. But the time I mentioned crawdad, she knew what I meant. So from that point on, every time somebody asked her what I did, I studied crayfish, not crawdads, because crawdads are the ones you eat, and crayfish are the ones that you study. Not true, but hey, she was proud of it, so whatever got it out there. So what is a crayfish? So a crayfish is an aquatic or semi-aquatic arthropod that respires with gills, has 5 pairs of non-feeding appendages, or 10 appendages in total, hence the order of Decapoda. It's dorsally ventrally flattened. It's a dorsally ventrally flattened abdomen and has direct development, meaning it doesn't have any, what it looks like as a young of year is what it looks like as an adult. Doesn't have any metamorphosis. So where are crayfish? Crayfish are from 5 of the 7 continents. They're absent only from Africa and Antarctica, and they're composed of 4 families. You have Parastachidae, which is primarily in Australia and South America. You have Astacids or Astacidae, which is in Europe and Western United States. And then you have the recently kind of split off Camberoididae. You can tell it's been recently split off because I still can't pronounce it. These occur in eastern Russia and some of the islands there off the eastern seaboard of Russia. And then the one that I'll talk about mainly today is the Camberidae, which is the only species that occurs natively within uh, eastern, east central U.S., southeast, kind of down into Mexico as well. Over here, the photos on the right, the top photo is just some kind of what species representing the different photos, different families. You have Aristachidae with the Murray crayfish, the signal crayfishes, which is a species native to Western U.S., and the Korean crayfish, which is in that new split out family, Cambaroidae. So, what is the diversity of crayfishes? Um, Pretty diverse fauna, really. North America makes up a very large part of known species. This table's a little outdated. The North America is now probably closer to probably over 450 species now. They're being described at a pretty quick rate, with a lot of aquatic taxa. There's a lot of splitting going on right now, and that's kind of bumping up the numbers a bit. Australia, though, has quite a few species as well, with 151, and then South America and Europe. South America right now is probably describing the most species. Uh, I just went to a conference, international crayfish conference, and there was 4 or 5 talks on new species there from South America, especially Brazil. So that number is definitely outdated and it's going up quick. And then pretty modest numbers in Europe and Asia and Madagascar. But as you can tell, they occur all over, and there's actually some general interest in them in a lot of these other countries as well. Then when you kind of look at a heat map of kind of where these species are, that big bulk of diversity, well, the laser pointer here, occurs down here in the southeast United States. These drainages, I believe these are Huck 8s, um, or maybe Huck 6s, doesn't matter. These drainages, some of these drainages are kind of up into southern Illinois, southern Missouri, um, so pretty diverse. Alabama and Tennessee are the two most diverse states. Um, Alabama uh, just had its 100th species described from the state, just past couple of years. And I think Tennessee's now up over 70 or 80 species. So really diverse states. However, in Illinois, still relatively diverse compared to other states. We have currently 25 described species. Um, 7 of those 25 are species of greatest conservation need. 4 of those 7 are considered state in danger or threatened. We actually have a possible 5th of those 7 that is in the um, process right now of getting added to the state endangered and threatened list. We're hoping that goes through. It's the little Wabash crayfish, and I'll maybe talk a little bit more about it a little later. It's really an interesting species. It occurs only in the little Wabash drainage of Illinois. It's one of the few um, macro taxa, crayfish, fish, mussels, that is strictly endemic to aquatic taxa that is strictly endemic to Illinois. It occurs nowhere else outside of the Little Wabash drainage. So that's a species we've added recently, and it was definitely warranted. We have 2 invasive species of primary concern, which I will talk about a little bit later. Um, Species that you're probably are all familiar with, Baxonius rusticus and Procamerus clarki. They're commonly in the news, as well as kind of less common, less known. We have 7 primary burrowing species, and I'll kind of go into those a little bit because everybody always finds those fascinating because of the little mounds they make. When you look at the history of collections for Illinois for crayfish, really pre-1995 by Dr. Chris Taylor, Dr. Larry Page. Um, a lot of those people really did a really good job sampling. A lot of this was intended fish sampling, but you got a crayfish, you threw it in the kill jar, and it got ID'd back at the lab as well. Pre-1995, we had really good coverage. However, since 1995, it's really just been focused in Southern Illinois in the Chicago area, um, mainly in the Chicago area because of invasive species, in Northern Illinois because of invasive species, because of rusticus, and then Southern Illinois because that is where all of the species of greatest conservation need occur. As I mentioned, Illinois has 25 total species, um, and they're a pretty wide range. This is Lacuna Cambarus polychromatus. This is a primary burrower, and these characteristics, chelae size and rostrum shape and size, are kind of a good, quick way to differentiate, differences between species, or if you have multiple species. Um, Primary burrowers will typically have these kind of bigger, bulkier chelae along this outside margin of the chelae is very thin, and that's meant to scrape and move and push and roll mud out of their burrows. So they're very adapted to that lifestyle. This is Procambarus clarki. These species get very large. They have very long chelae, very long appendages. They can reach out far. Fend off predators. They have very large gape sizes, cause for very large gape sizes in fish, so they're not easily always predated upon. Then you have more of what is standard and native to Illinois, which is the Faxonia species. Um, you know, pretty just kind of modest. This is what most people picture when they think crayfish. You just have average chelae size, normal rostrum, normal body pattern color, really kind of nondescript. And this is what Virulus falls into, which is probably one of the most widespread, which is the most widespread species in the Midwest, um, as well as Rusticus, which is one of the most introduced, which is the widest introduced species in the Midwest as well. So we'll kind of spend some time talking about burrowing crayfish, just because people always find them really interesting, and I do too. Before I started here, it's not something I did a lot on, but now that I'm here and started working on them, it's a entirely new world when it comes to crayfish. And here recently, uh, crayfish research has really been um, kind of geared towards understanding these burrowing crayfish. So there's three types. The two main ones, the ones that are considered main burrowers, are the primary and secondary burrowers. These primary burrowers, uh, you know, usually will have a burrow with no direct connection to a stream or a permanent water body, where secondary burrowers will have that connection to a permanent water body. Now there is times where primary and secondary burrowers they're not exclusive. There's a lot of overlap between those. So much to the point that a lot of people, when they talk about burrowers, they just talk about burrowers. They don't talk about primary or secondary because there is so much overlap. Um, they can be, as I mentioned before, with these chelae, very thin on that side to push, move, roll around dirt. These species spend about 90 to 95% of their life uh, underground, especially for some of the Australian species, can be very deep. There's been records of burrows being as deep as 3 meters in Australia. Luckily, for the sake of my hands and sanity, in the Midwest and the US, you typically don't see that. Deepest we get here is about a meter, so 3 to 4 feet. I think the deepest I've dug is a little over 3 feet, which is still pretty deep to get a little crayfish, but hey, somebody's got to do it. Um, and a lot of people are like, oh, when I talk about burrowers, it's like, oh, that's what is in our yards and stuff. And so there's a lot of differences in how these burrows look. A lot of times you'll see um, these chimneys or these fresh mud outside the burrows. And we always get questions of like, well, can I run over? Will it hurt them if I hit them, run over them with a mower or stuff like that? No, chances are burrowing crayfish are very particular about keeping their burrow clean and tidy. So if you do it, chances are the next time it rains, you'll just see that chimney back up there again. So it doesn't hurt to run over them unless it hurts your mower. Then you may be a little concerned. Um, so burrowing crayfish have a lot of importance that are really just kind of coming to light recently. They've found that they're really kind of a crucial part of wetland habitat function. And there's some evidence to suggest that there actually could be a good indicator species of a properly functioning wetland type habitat. So within these wetland habitats, they kind of turn, especially in high densities, they can turn the soil, they can aerate the soil, they can kind of provide that connection between the groundwater and the surface, as well as move nutrients around and add nutrients to the system. And they occur in all types of wetlands, or just basically if there's any way that they can get to the water table, they're going to be there. So you find them in these roadside slough type habitats where there's a permanent water body, and these are all sites that we've sampled. Where there's permanent water body, you'll find them all along there. You'll find them in these wetland forests types habitats. You'll find them in these just big open fields that are within this middle of a giant floodplain, as well as a real affinity for manicured lawns. We find a lot of them in front of, schools, nursing homes, hospitals. It's one of the biggest species of burrowing crayfish we actually have in our collection from Illinois. Came from a hospital right in the middle of town, right in the ditch in the middle of town. So really, they will occur pretty much anywhere you give them a chance. Burrow table is close, semi-close to the surface. And also within Illinois, there are some species that benefit from these burrows, especially some threatened and endangered species. You have the Heinz emerald dragonfly, which uses the crayfish burrows, as well as the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, which kind of has an interesting relationship with burrowing crayfish. You will see uh, it's been documented that they'll share in the winter, they will share burrows with crayfish, yet there's little evidence so far to back up that they are actually eating the crayfish. So it's almost like a mutualistic relationship, which makes sense because a lot of times in the winter, these burrows, crayfish burrows gets capped. And if the snake eats the crayfish during the winter, that snake may not be getting out come springtime because of the plug that's in the hole. Um, so they've actually documented snakes, Massasaugas, and crayfish inhabiting the same burrow at the same time, and then returning, the snakes leaving and returning to that burrow, and the crayfish still being in that burrow. So it's a really interesting relationship and something that we're kind of getting ready to start working on a little bit more in the future to kind of understand that relationship a little more. Because a lot of times, the reason the snakes, I should mention, the reason the snakes use these burrows is because a lot of times in the winter, the crayfish will burrow down to below the frost line. So the snakes will go in the hole and get below that frost line and survive during the winter, during hibernation, during hibernacula. So in Illinois, as I mentioned, we have 7 burrowing species. Um, and most of these species occur as well, occur in Illinois, but also occur throughout the Midwest. You have Lacuna cambaris polychromatus, which occurs in the lower 2/3 of the state, represented here by the green triangles. You have Lacuna cambaris nebraskensis, which is probably the most widespread Lacuna cambaris species. It occurs throughout the northern half of Illinois, and it occurs all the way over into Nebraska, South Dakota, Minnesota, Missouri, very wide-ranging species. Then you have the newly described or split Lacuna cambaris chimera, which only occurs down here in extreme southern Illinois. I'll come back to this individual. You have Chrysaornis fodiens, which is a different genus. It occurs mainly in the southern half of the state, represented here by the yellow triangles. But it has a interesting disjunct population because it has been found, it has sustainable populations in the Chicago area, mainly in some of the forest reserves and forest habitat and some of the habitat they have around Chicago and remnant wetland habitat. So it's kind of an interesting thing that maybe the species over its history couldn't quite keep up with a lot of the, if these populations were connected, maybe it couldn't keep up with some of that agricultural development that happened throughout central Illinois. And then you have Procambarus gracilis, which is probably one of the more widespread species in the state. This is the prairie crayfish. This is one that's a lot of times when you're out in prairies and wetlands, out completely away from any single water body source, and you see a burrow just out in the middle of nowhere, that's probably this guy. Um, Also, probably one of the prettier species we have in the state when you get a nice male that's not covered in mud. But one thing too, I want to point out with all these species, even though they represent different genuses, you still have that basic chelae shape that all burrowers have. That's kind of thin margin on that outside thing of that chelae to move, push, and manipulate dirt. Um, if anybody here is familiar with crayfish, you may remember that there used to be a crayfish in Illinois, a burrowing crayfish called Diogenes. It used to be Cambarus Diogenes, then Lacuna Cambarus Diogenes. So I just always have to plug here that there's actually no more Lacuna Cambarus Diogenes in the state. It's strictly restricted to the East Coast, and that's where some of the diversity in Illinois has come from within that family because that species has been pretty extensively split out into think about 12 to 15 different species now. Um, I mentioned I'd come back to this guy. This was a species, as you can tell, that was originally called Chimera. But as you can tell, they look a little different. So we came across these individuals when I was doing my resurvey of Illinois crayfish. And the species, we did some genetic work, and right now we're calling it a unique lineage. It is a burrowing species that occurs primarily here in the Shawnee Hills. So stay tuned. Uh, Hopefully, maybe here in the next year or two, we'll have a 26 species and an eighth burrowing species in the state. Maybe one that could possibly be another state endemic. So, kind of getting into a little bit more detailed habitat, I won't spend a whole lot of time on this. The key thing really to take away is water table depth for burrowing crayfish is one of the most significant factors of where they occur. We had a grad student who kind of worked alongside me, helped me with the resurvey, and she did a project at Nachusa grasslands up in northern Illinois, looking at water table depth related to burrow abundance and presence. And burrow abundance and presence, the single strongest correlate is water table depth. So the shallower the water table, the more burrows, the more likely there would be burrows. Not surprising, but this is something people who study crayfish long figured, but we never had really good empirical proof that it was there. And so what we did, we had a soil scientist help us. We took soil cores at each transect, each thing. So I took over 100 soil cores, and then we had a soil scientist tell us where that water table set the majority of the year, and that level was directly correlated to that. So again, not groundbreaking, but we finally had the proof that for years crayfish scientists have been saying, it's where the water table is. Well, there's the proof. So we were excited about that. It's a really interesting study and paper if you guys are interested. So I have to mention, and this will be kind of a segue into the next section, um, the there's a third class of burrowers. These are tertiary burrowers, and these are typically just any species you find in streams and stuff. Um, I have found over years of doing this, a majority of species will burrow in um, some aspect as water becomes scarce through either drought or they've noticed this with some damming or road crossings when water drawdowns take place in lakes or wetlands. a lot of crayfish, most crayfish will burrow in some um, aspect to get to that water. Now, if it gets too deep, they don't have that specialized chelae to get to really efficiently dig. So basically, if it keeps getting shallower, they can't keep going down. But that's why they're called tertiary burrowers. You will find them burrowing in some aspect in the substrate, upstreams and stuff, when times are hard. That is a good segue into stream crayfish. So we talked about burrowers. Stream crayfish are, the ones that more people are familiar with. These are the ones that, when you were kids, a lot of kids go out and collect them or grab them from streams and things like that, or you just come across a healthy stream with crayfish going everywhere, rocky when you flip rocks. A lot of us have seen it, but they're very important to these stream ecosystems. Um, everybody gives a lot of credit to beavers for being these big ecosystem engineers, and they are at a very coarse scale, or at a coarser scale. But when you look at these fine kind of micro scales, crayfish are right up there with them, much they engineer their environment. They're constantly moving around rocks, shifting rocks, creating excavations under bigger rocks, under smaller rocks, moving sand. They're very busy bodies a lot of times in these streams. It's very fascinating to just go snorkel and watch them. What they do is they move things around. And in that movement, like with beavers, creates little microhabitats for other species, for other aquatic invertebrates, for fish, creates some spawning habitat for some fish to lay their eggs, to be able to get under rocks and things like that. They may not have been um, able to if it wasn't for the crayfish. So it is really fascinating how much these species can manipulate their environment. Also, crayfish are an integral part of aquatic food webs. They occupy multiple trophic levels. They can be decomposers, eating detrital material, broken down logs. And they'll process biofilm and anything they can to get the nutrients they need. They'll also consume primary aquatic macrophytes or even terrestrial macrophytes, terrestrial vegetation. Um, they'll also be a secondary consumer or a primary predator. They will uh, eat larval fish, um, fish eggs, other aquatic invertebrates. They've found those in their stomach contents and with stable isotope analysis. And then all that being said, they're also a primary food source for fishes. Some previous studies have shown that sport fishes can consume up to 65% of annual production of crayfishes. So a very large portion, especially in Ozark streams where crayfish are the primary food source for fish, for some charchids species. And then even after all that, they still can make up 50% of the invertebrate biomass in streams. Yeah, they're larger than a lot of the other invertebrates, but they can also occur at pretty high densities. There's a saying kind of in the crayfish realm that, you know, crayfish eat everything and everything eats crayfish. And it holds pretty true a lot of the times we found out. So what are some of the general habitats that you find stream crayfish in? Well, streams, but not just streams. You find them from, small to medium, what you think picturesque uh, Ozark streams, rocky riffles to aquatic vegetation, nice meanders, these picturesque streams that you would think of high quality. But you can also find them in kind of ditches or sloughs and habitats that you may not think of as high quality. But to a crayfish, this may be perfect. This may be exactly what they need. And then you can even find them in habitats that are severely degraded. And if anybody's familiar with kind of southern Illinois, this is the Little Wabash River, which is a very degraded system over the years. It's kind of one of my favorite systems just because I feel like there has potential to be a really full watershed, a really significant watershed, if we could clean it up. But yeah, crayfish even occur here where there's been all kinds of anthropogenic disturbances um, that have taken part in that system, and they're still finding ways to hold on there. Kind of getting to more empirical type data. Uh, a lot of the species, though, especially this is mainly true for some of the rare species of greatest conservation need, kind of species with narrow ranges. Those species typically do have a relationship with higher quality habitats. So the SGCNs, that's what kind of makes them a, makes them a SGCN species, is they have to have that higher quality habitat to occur, and that's why they're on that list because this type of quality habitat, we're losing it, especially in Illinois, Southern Illinois. Little Wabash Rivers is a key example. Um, Another type of habitat that we have to watch out for and hopefully correct is this coarse substrate. We like to see a lot of coarse substrate. Crayfish like cover, especially when it's uh, especially rocks, large wood, anything that can protect them from above, they're all about it. And so coarse substrate is a good predictor of crayfish presence. However, just having coarse substrate isn't enough. With a lot of these streams, silt is becoming a very uh, big problem with agriculture and things like that and runoff. So, these interstitial spaces, the crayfish aren't able to use them or keep them clean to the point they used to be. When you start seeing armoring, things like that, even a crayfish can't dig into some of how armored some of these streams can be. So that's a thing we look out for, and we've been noticing a lot that a lot of these species are kind of ranges are becoming reduced because of how much silt. The rock's still there, but now it's just covered in silt. And you see that, these are the coarse scale, but you also see that at a fine scale. Can't talk about crayfish size without bringing up uh, Astacopsis goldii, which is the giant Tasmanian crayfish. If anybody watches the Discovery Channel, you've probably seen this species on there, Nat Geo, uh, with Jeremy Wade, the river monsters guy. He's caught this, but this is a species in Tasmania. It's, the common name is the giant Tasmanian freshwater lobster, and it is the size of a lobster. This is kind of our poster child for large crayfish. Nothing gets much bigger. Nothing gets bigger than that. So what do crayfish eat? We talked about these integral parts, these food webs. I really think they're just kind of opportunistic omnivores. They eat whatever they can find. That may be this algae or biofilm that grows on rocks and streams. They may start processing detrital material if that's what they have. Aquatic macrophytes. They'll even crush and eat, some of these fingernail clams, snails, other aquatic invertebrates, and even larval fish and fish eggs. If they can catch it or get it in their mouth or in their mandibles, they're going to eat it, or they're going to try to find a way to eat it. I actually have a crayfish in tank in my office, and I made the mistake of putting some plastic plants in there just for make it look nice. And the crayfish ate the plastic plants. Wasn't able to process them, but came in there, noticed there's little plastic pieces floating all around my tank, and it would eat in the plastic plant. So they will literally try to eat anything. So crayfish have this interesting thing where they molt between reproductively active males, molt between reproductively active and reproductive stage and non-reproductive stage. This typically occurs for species in the Midwest. They molt into this reproductive stage, this form one, you can see down here, usually in the fall, and they'll stay in that phase all the way through uh, March to April. No, this is during the time where they're trying to breed, trying to find a female, and the females are in berry or ovigerous. Um, and then when I say gonopods, this is the male reproductive organ, or what gonopods are. Um, this also is a primary characteristic for identifying species. Uh, there's, just like there's great diversity in chelate shapes and stuff like that, and color patterns with crayfish, there's a lot of diversity in uh, gonopodal uh, morphology. As you can kind of see here, this is Faxonia, so this is your species like rusticus and virilis. This is actually virilis. You see they kind of become longer and um, more malleable. They're not as stiff and rigid, and that's to help with depositing sperm. Same with Procambarus species. This is a Procambarus clarki. You kind of have this big blocky thing, and then for form one, a little more open, a little more malleable. So copulation occurs in late fall or early spring here in the Midwest. Um, it changes a little bit. It does change as you go farther south. We actually think that there may be two breeding seasons. Um, Farther south you get, we're kind of coming across that. I'm actually in Texas right now. We're kind of coming across that down here right now, especially with burrowing species. Um, Females lay eggs in March or April. They attach them to their abdomen through ovipositors, and they'll carry those for 2 to 3 weeks. And as those eggs will hatch, and then the crayfish, the little juveniles, will slowly start to develop, usually for a little over an additional week, to the point where they just look like little crayfish, to which the mother will then kind of release them and they'll kind of go on about their own lives. So size and growth and age is still something we're working on. As I mentioned, they'll molt between these forms, usually in the spring and fall. You have two molts per year. They'll increase in size 5 to 10% per molt, so they're pretty slow growing. And then we think most species within the Midwest live 3 years in perfect conditions. That's probably on the low side. They can probably live a lot longer. In captivity, we've documented them living a lot longer. And unfortunately, there's not a great way to age crayfish. Since they have an exoskeleton, they don't have a whole lot of calcified structures to be able to count rings. There's been some evidence of looking at gastric mills, which are right here, looking at the size of those, or cutting those with a same thing that you cut fish otoliths with, and trying to count the rings on those. It's kind of had limited success. There's also been some work on using the eye stalk to count. Again, kind of limited success. Right now it's still the tried and true method that everybody uses. It's the length frequency histogram, which are pretty hit or miss for crayfish. So kind of getting into conservation, crayfish are right up there with freshwater mussels. This is a little outdated, but it hasn't really changed with crayfishes. They're the second, one of the second um, most threatened species with either, extinction imperiled, these G ranks, right behind mussels. And yet, they don't completely understand mussels deserve a lot of attention, but, crayfishes don't always get that attention though. They're fighting a lot of these same problems. With over, this number is only went up. It's probably closer to 60% now, with how many species are imperiled. So kind of then talking about some Illinois greatest species of greatest conservation need, as I mentioned, the four state endangered, or yeah, they're all state endangered over here down on the left. You have Placidus, which occurs in the Ohio River and the Big Creek in southeast Illinois, just a single Huck 10 drainage in Illinois and the Ohio. You have Kentuckiensis, which occurs in that same Big Creek drainage. Then you have Indianensis, which occurs in uh, these populations kind of in the northern part of the saline drainage are probably extirpated because this has all been converted to agriculture. These collections were from the 30s and 40s. And now we think it's pretty much restricted to these uh, south to north draining streams from the Shawnee Hills. So these kind of higher quality streams. Then you have Faxonius lancifer, which is only known from Horseshoe Lake in Alexandria County in southern Illinois, though the species is pretty widespread as you go farther south. Then the other three species of greatest conservation need Faxonia standardi is the one that we've petitioned to be added to the threatened and endangered species list for Illinois. And again, most of these collections that you're seeing here were prior to 2000. As part of my resurvey, we went back and sampled 10 to 15 sites, and we were only able to collect it from a single location. So this species is something we're definitely really concerned with. Faxonius illinoisensis occurs down here in the Shawnee Hills, hence the name, common name, Shawnee crayfish. And then tenebrosus, which is a headwater specialist, occurs in some of these headwater springs, again down the Shawnee Hills, and then you notice it up here a little bit um, in the Vermilion drainage. So what are some of these threats? Same thing with a lot of aquatic taxa. You have pollution from runoff, agriculture, cities, point source pollution, a lot of things. Crayfish are lucky. They can kind of tolerate some of this. Some of the more general species cans, but some of those SGCNs can't. Habitat alteration and water extraction. This is a big problem here. There is negative relationships with dams, low water crossings for some of these species, or anything that really kind of alters that natural flow regime of rivers. Water extraction is not as huge a deal probably here in Illinois. Down here in Texas, where I'm working, southern Texas, we're seeing a lot of historic locations for some of these rare crayfish down here. Their streams are completely dry, are bone dry, and we're not sure what that means for the crayfish. It can't be good. These ranges are really reducing down here in southern Texas. And then probably the biggest threat to just crayfish species worldwide is the introduction of non-native species. Again, kind of going into a little more detail here. Invasive species, crayfish anyway, are really kind of spread through two main means. At least historically, it was commercial, so through the food industry. This now includes the pet trade. Crayfish are becoming every year seem to be becoming more and more popular in the pet trade. You have special breeders now that are breeding to get specific colors, specific morphs. It's becoming a really kind of big business now. And then historically really moved around a lot because of bait bucket introductions. This is kind of a quick list of some of the ones that we know about. We have Virilis, Alabama, North Carolina, Washington. Species is native to Illinois, so not a big concern here. Rusticus, many of you know, it's one of the most widespread introduced species in North America. Galactus, also interesting enough, is an interbasin transfer in Missouri, so across basin boundaries, is actually causing some negative impacts on species there. Propinquus in Colorado, this is a native species in Illinois, and then Clarkii, which is probably is the most widespread introduced species worldwide. So as I mentioned, these interbasin species, we don't have a interbasin introductions. What I mean by that is we have a case of that in Illinois with Clarkii, because Clarkii is native to the southern half of the state, but is invasive up in the Chicago area and kind of throughout the northern half of the state. This is better documented in Missouri with Cutis, which is a similar taxa to Clarkii, it's Procambarus. Flieger did a lot of surveys, kind of similar to what Larry did here in Illinois, Larry Page, and found, in his surveys didn't find it hardly anywhere else in the state but these floodplains of the Mississippi River. However, as times went on, the species kept popping up outside of its native range, and that's what's meant by this interbasin introductions. They may not be native in this Huckate. They may be native in this Huckate, but then you hop over to this basin and they're not native, and you do see negative effects there. In Illinois specifically, I've kind of mentioned you have Rusticus, which was first introduced, we think around 1973 was when it kind of first started popping up. And that it's continued kind of to spread throughout Illinois. And then Clarkii, again, it's native down here, though it's kind of popping up now in these little isolated areas. most likely through the bait trade, though now the Chicago area ones were probably more from uh, supermarket releases and stuff like that. Which I think you guys have Katie O'Reilly who will talk about next week or a couple weeks, and I'm sure she'll mention some of that stuff as well with those. Um, Rusty crayfish kind of through the years, 1973 to 84, just a few populations, but then how that has changed. They just kind of really exploded because they get into these systems and there's just nothing there to keep them from out competing other species. And so we kind of went back and resampled this because in Wisconsin they noticed there was decline of them, these invasive species. We thought, maybe we could be seeing that here too. Maybe there is hope. Fortunately, not yet. We went back and sampled 5 historic locations that we had density data on, and every single site we've noticed a significant increase in, except one, we noticed a pretty significant increase in the density of rusticus from northern Illinois streams, and almost all the sites a reduction to nothing for the sympatric species. So not not looking good in a lot of these areas. And the main, that whole idea behind that was displacement, and this is something that's occurring through a lot of these introductions. Missouri just had 2 species federally listed, Paruncus and Quadruncus. And a big part of the reason they were listed is because they are being displaced by an interbasin transfer from Hylas. Then you have Rusticus, which is really truly hit Wisconsin hard, and they're kind of now finally starting to rebound a little bit up there. The native species are. Then Neglectus being introduced into some other streams in Illinois, really kind of pushing out a lot of the native rarer species. So the displacement is it happens pretty frequently when these non-native species get introduced. So that kind of brings us to something that we've been talking about and that I would always kind of like help on with some of these people, with some of the group that goes out and monitors some of these rivers and stuff, is that it'd always be nice to have, we always need more data. So it'd be nice to have the ability to, through citizen science, to be able to identify new and also monitor some of these current invasive populations. And this is something that hopefully in the future we can kind of train on how to do that standardized. So we can look at how these populations are changing over time and maybe start to look and see that what's happening in Wisconsin may be starting to happen in some of these streams in Illinois. It'll also help us monitor species of greatest conservation need, again, which is something that would be a great resource. And crayfish, if you have a high diversity of crayfish, typically you have a good stream health. It's usually a pretty reliable thing. If you have a high density, that means you have a very usually means you can have a pretty heterogeneous habitat and a lot of space for multiple crayfish. And then identify new populations of burrowers. Even just knowing where burrows are located would be a big help. Where we can go spend more time, or where high densities of burrows are. So for part of my survey, resurvey of Illinois, I spent a lot of time driving down roads in southern Illinois, trying just to find burrows. And you pick up some little things here and there that you kind of know where to look, but we're missing large swaths of land because we're just not sure within those where to find the burrows. And that's where people on the ground really help. So kind of in the immediate how to help though, um, you know, identify, if you find an invasive species in a stream or what you think's invasive, send it to me or send a photo to me anytime. There's a great there's a great how-to do crayfish photos on iNaturalist. You can just Google iNaturalist and crayfish photo. Kind of tells you what the best photos to do. But honestly, if you can just get a photo of um, the male gonopods, close up of the chelae, and then kind of a profile and dorsal view and the location, I can typically, it's in the Midwest where there's not a super high diversity. I can usually get it narrowed down to what it is. So yeah, and if that, feel free to email me those pictures. I'll have my email in the next slide anytime. I would much rather know than not know, and I would much rather my email be blown up with crayfish pictures than um, emails from the university. So anytime. And hopefully in the future, if this is something that people are interested in, we could do. I hope to be able to do some more, hands-on type stuff. Um, teach people how to identify crayfish, key characteristics to look for, even if that means just more specifically just invasive species. But once you kind of know the basic anatomy of crayfish, you can start learning. Best way to learn is just to go out and collect them and look at them. And you can start to pick that up pretty quickly, similar to any taxa, really. So with that, I will thank you for my time. Thank you for your time. And I'll take any questions. And again, my email is at the bottom. And please feel free to reach out at any time, and I will. Um, it may take me a day or two, but I'll always reply to questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dusty, for the great presentation. And as you said, we're opened up for questions. So, and if you would like, you can put questions in the chat box and I can read it out loud, or you are welcome to unmute yourself and ask your own questions. And I guess I'll go ahead and get us started since I don't see anyone jumping at the chance. So in a healthy stream or maybe a wetland ecosystem, how many different species of crayfish can typically kind of coexist within a habitat like that, if it's a healthy
Uh,
system?
a healthy system, so a lot of that depends on uh, where you're at in the U.S. So typically on the high end, you're looking at 7 species. I think some of the highest that we've came across. Um, but in Illinois, good system, 3 to 4 species is really good for stream systems, especially in Southern Illinois. Just because we don't in Illinois we don't have that diversity, say that Alabama or Tennessee or even Southern Missouri does. But 3 to 4 species in a Southern Illinois stream, like I'm talking like streams in the Shawnee Hills that are kind of more protected, the watershed's a little more protected. It's not uncommon to get 3, 4 species. And usually that's a combination of uh, primarily stream species as well as a burrower or two. Um, with burrowing crayfish, um, typically you will only get 1 to 2 species at a site, though again, we're kind of in the infancy of understanding burrowing crayfish habitat. Um, so when you do get multiple, we're still trying to tease apart whether that's a sign of good habitat or that's just where all these ranges are now finally overlapping. Um, so that we're still not sure on if that's a direct one-to-one ratio. More burrowing species equals better wetland habitat. Um, but yeah, even now it's not uncommon. It's not super uncommon to get at least 2 species. Typically, I'd say you get about 2 species of burrowers at a site normally if it's kind of a well-functioning wetland site.
So was there any chance that they would be sharing a burrow? Or I mean, it's probably kind of hard to tell because it's difficult to follow the whole tube, the whole chain of tubes, but uh,
Um, yeah. So we have collected. We do think that um, males and females during copulation will share a burrow. We have collected males and females from the same burrow that from the same plug burrow in the early spring. So there is some evidence to suggest that they may be some of the burrowing species may be um, overwintering together, even possibly. But yeah, you definitely we do see them sharing burrows. It's not super common, but then again, it may not be common because we may not be able to sample them when they are sharing that burrow. If they are sharing that burrow over winter, in Illinois, it's kind of hard to even dig down a couple inches when that ground gets frozen. Um, so yeah, they will share the burrow. Now we don't see any. at least I haven't seen any multi-species sharing a burrow, like a species of one and a species of another sharing the same burrow. I haven't witnessed that, and haven't came across that. Um, but as for multiple crayfish sharing a burrow, yeah, we've documented it a few times.
Okay. Have a question from Jessica. Do we know the timeline of crayfish evolution? Specifically, is the Asteracidae, I'm probably mispronounced that, sorry, in Western US and Europe with the other group in between? Did the Camberidae split off from them?
I'm not sure. Evolution's not my strong suit. Um, uh, they so the I do know that the species that stackids, I just say stackids. It's a lot easier than trying to say the other. In Western US have been introduced into the European populations. It was really kind of one of the first species to be introduced into Europe, and I mean one of the recent ones to be introduced into Europe, and they have caused decline. So they are close enough related to um, hybridize, but they're farther enough from each other that there's a thing in Europe. It's in the U.S. too, but our crayfish are immune to it, called the crayfish plague. It's a it's a virus that um, crayfish in Europe get from North American crayfish, and it can wipe out uh, large populations of crayfish or large, seemingly healthy populations of crayfish pretty quickly. And the crayfish will get really large lesions and kind of shell, like kind of what you'd imagine shell rot and stuff looking like on their carapace and things like that. So the stackids in Western US are immune to that or have built up an immunity to that, while the ones in Europe, at the time of introduction or not, there's some evidence so that they are kind of slowly starting to build up immunity, but it's nowhere near what it was, what is there. But as for the direct um, distance of relatedness, evolution's not my strong suit, so uh, not a whole lot of help there. There is some good literature out there on that from I think Fetzner's done some James Fetzner has done some of the uh, evolutionary work with that, as well as Keith Crandall. So those are some places you could look for sure that I think would have more information on that.
Okay, great. And then Bob asks, there are some large caves in southwestern Illinois with perennial streams that have cave-adapted isopods and amphipods, yet unlike Missouri and Kentucky, we have no cave-adapted crayfish. Do you care to speculate why?
So, I not, I'm not sure. I've wondered the same thing. There's two things that I think I would be interested um, in an eDNA study for. Kind of the big thing now is eDNA as well. To look for some of these um, cave crayfish in Illinois, because I'm not completely convinced that you wouldn't find them. They can be very hard to find. They're never. When I worked for Missouri, we worked on a cave species in South Central Missouri, and they're never in high densities. I mean, we'd go into this cave and we only knew it. Has only ever been documented from a single cave, and you'd only ever see 2 to 3 individuals. Um, However, when they did eDNA, they did some of the other caves species had never been detected in, and they got eDNA hits from those caves. I the vast amount of water that's moving around through those systems that goes unseen um, could be kind of hiding cave crayfish in Illinois. It's something I've thought about, and I mean It's kind of where I'm at. I think they're in Southern Illinois. I think they're somewhere. I just don't think we've came across them yet. And we have that way with other species as well. Um, you also have some of the cave fish that Missouri has and Kentucky and stuff have that we don't. But also there could be a geological standpoint by how those areas were formed or the way that um, the two major rivers that kind of come through there kind of maybe affected that or inundated some of those systems to where the cave species didn't persist is another possibility. Also, those areas in southern Illinois probably were affected a little more by, um, again, this kind of goes back to the evolution question. Probably had a little more impact from glaciation, maybe not to, obviously not to the extent of, glaciers, but colder, colder year-round temperatures maybe down there. Maybe that just was kind of a little bit beyond that threshold. Could have been maybe why you don't see some of those species there. Again, that's just speculating. I haven't looked into it too much, but um, that would be my ideas.
Hey, great. Um, Anyone else have questions? Oh, okay. So I think more of a comment. Bill Brower says, my students always had a blast collecting crayfish during stream sampling. Um, IDing the, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it because I'm just going to mess it up. IDing the one species was not too hard.
Yeah, yeah. The I think I it popped up down there. I think it was Baxonius or
Yes.
Baxonius. How people say it different ways depending where you're at. Um, yeah, they can be uh, a little, in my opinion. Some people are everybody's different. Like my former um, boss and kind of who I worked for when I first here, Chris Taylor, Dr. Chris Taylor. He swears that the Procambarus species are the easiest to identify. To me, they were always the hardest. And Faxonius was always the easiest for me, kind of similar to what you said. But I think that's kind of familiarity. Like, so I did a lot of work and no, I'm perfect. And yeah, he always said that the Procambarus were always the easiest to identify. I still don't know where he's getting that from because to me, they are not. They're the only one of the few species you actually have. I think you have to have a microscope even to identify large individuals because you're looking for so many differences in the changing of some of those processes on the Form 1 gonopods. But yeah, the Faxonius to me have always been easiest, especially again in Illinois where you don't have that diverse as much diversity. Um, the differences between species that overlap are pretty significant. Where it's not are usually introduced species. It can be if you're not going off color pattern or something like that, it can be difficult to distinguish between um, Pincuus and Rusticus. They're pretty similar with gonopod structure, but usually when you're in the field, you're seeing the live individual and alive, they look nothing alike. So that's yeah, Faxonius typically is easier, and I think it's great that you take students out. Like I, I realized like, oh, how'd you get studying crayfish? I wanted to do private land conservation. I just got that job as undergrad, and crayfish have a way of once they kind of get a hold of you with a Keeley, you kind of never can completely get away from them. I've done fish stuff, but I always end up coming back to trying to trying to squeeze a crayfish project into anything I do. So they have a way of dragging you back in for sure.
Right. Okay, well, it looks like that's about it for tonight. Thank you for that great presentation, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Before you go, I do want to mention that our next Fall Speaker Series event will be in a couple of weeks on Thursday, November 14th at 7 p.m. Katie O'Reilly from Illinois Indiana Sea Grant will be presenting on aquatic invasive species. So again, we'll probably hear a little bit more about crayfish, but we'll be talking about a lot of other species as well. And also for those of you who are interested in joining our winter chloride watchers to see how road salt use is impacting a waterway near you, We have a couple more of our 1 hour training opportunities coming up, including one that will be tomorrow night. So for details on those, you can visit our RiverWatch Facebook page and just check out the events that we have listed, and then you can check it out that way. All right. And once again, thank you all for being here and have a lovely evening.